May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Now's the time that you can get out your crossword puzzles or your knitting or whatever else you want to do. I'm sure we're all familiar with the metaphors that we use in our language. Burning the candle at both ends, or up a creek without a paddle. Well, in our two main stories in today's gospel text, we get, I think, what we could call mixed metaphors. The first theme is about fishing, and the second is about shepherding. Well, when we put these things together, we get mixed metaphors. We come up with fishing for sheep or shepherding fish. Now, as mixed as these metaphors may be, together they provide, I think, a rather wonderful balance for a church's ministry. Now, so many times it's hard to set a firm time frame, a timeline for the stories that are in our gospel text, because chapter 21 of John is thought to be an epilogue or an afterthought. Last week's gospel, if you'll remember, ended with these words. It said, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you may have life in his name. Now, when we go back and we review or try to review and remember all of the events of Holy Week leading up to Easter, and of course the Sunday of the Resurrection, we remember that Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus appeared to Mary and other women. And then that evening he appeared to the disciples who were huddled in the upper room, scared to death of what might be coming. But Thomas, of course, was not there, which in our lectionary is why we get Doubting Thomas the Sunday after the resurrection. Then a week later, Jesus appears to the disciples again, and that's when he makes his personal appeal to Thomas. Today's story in John 21 takes place some time after those events, but we really don't know how long afterwards that it happened. What we do know in today's gospel is that several of the disciples were gathered together in one place, and I tend to believe that they were still confused and had no idea how they were going to carry on their ministry after Jesus' resurrection. Even though Jesus had proved his resurrection to them, things were obviously different, and so they didn't quite know what to do. We can imagine that there was a conversation going on, and Peter, we all know Peter, he tends to stick his foot in his mouth. He says, I'm tired of sitting around here waiting. I've got to get out of this place. I am going fishing. And the other disciples probably jumped up and chimed in and said, we'll all go with you. At least somebody made a decision. They were all eager to return to what was familiar to them. Now, some biblical scholars have suggested that this fishing trip was an act of doubt. I even read one description that called it a sin. But the disciples had been fishermen long before Jesus called them from their nets. And perhaps this night of fishing meant that they had given up on their new vocation and they were returning to their previous way of making a living. But I prefer to think of this fishing trip as merely a nighttime stress reliever. I think that often a fishing trip is a wonderful excuse to leave the stress of the workaday world behind and return to nature for a brief time, which is how I explain my new rod and reel to my wife. The gospel text tells us that the disciples had spent all night fishing. They'd throw the net out, bring it back, and it was empty. And they'd throw it out, and then they'd bring it back, and it was empty. And if the disciples were anything like me, I think they were probably very frustrated, because at daybreak they had been fishing all night and they hadn't caught a thing. Well, if you have been around lakes much, in the early morning at dawn there's a mist that comes up off the lake, and it tends to obscure. Now remember, they were about 100 yards out from the shore. So this mist was blocking what they could see, but they could hear a voice saying, "Have you anything to eat? Cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." Like most fishermen, they were tireless in their pursuit of fish. Even today, fishermen seem to like nothing better than trying a new bait or a new lure. Tackle boxes are filled with hundreds or even thousands of varieties of lures. I haven't broken that one yet. These early fishermen were just as willing to try a new spot. So they cast their nets on the other side of the boat, on the right side. And that's when they snagged a surprising catch, 153 fish. Now our text tells us that it was a miracle that the nets did not break. And this miraculous catch caused John to look closer at this mysterious figure on the shore, and the mist was starting to lift, and he finally recognized that it was Jesus. And when he exclaimed, "It's the Lord," Peter grabbed his clothes, jumped in the water, and began to swim toward Jesus. The other disciples struggled with the boat and with the heavy net of fish, but they were successful, and they got them both to the shore. So I think this whole post-resurrection fishing expedition causes us to ask, what does it mean for us? Well, I think it reflects back to the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, when he found some fishermen and said to them, "Come, follow me, and I will make you into fishers for men." This analogy represented Jesus' earthly description of the work that he was calling these guys to do. They were fishermen, and he called them to fish for people. These disciples had likely felt that it was an appropriate description of their ministry with Jesus, because people seemed to flock around him like a school of fish. But what would their job be after the resurrection? They were confused with Jesus' off and on appearances. What are they going to do without him? The boss was gone. Well, I really think that this experience is an acted out parable, not unlike those of the Old Testament prophets. The message is that they were to continue to fish for people. And their post-resurrection catch would be larger than they could ever imagine. Larger than anything that they'd encountered so far. Now, there have been a lot of books written about the significance of the 153 fish that filled their net. The most commonly accepted interpretation of this number comes from the 4th century theologian Jerome, who writes that there were, in 1st century Galilee, 153 different species of fish. So what's happening here is we're being told that the net wasn't just filled with 153 fish, but of 153 different fish. Maybe Jerome got it right, maybe not. It's not important. But one thing is certain. The net was empty all night long as the fishermen used their tried and true fishing techniques. But when they followed Jesus' direction to do things differently, the net was full of large fish. And it wasn't one of those fisherman stories. They were large fish and the net didn't break. Their capacity to catch fish grew with their obedience. Might be a lesson there. Then after breakfast, Jesus and Peter go for a walk down the beach, and they have a short but repetitive conversation. 3 times Jesus says, "Simon, do you love me?" And 3 times Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And each time Jesus responds with a command to care for his sheep. The first time he says, "Feed my sheep." The second time he says, "Tend my sheep." And the third time he says, "Feed my sheep." I think it's easy to see the connection between Peter's early 3 denials, and now we have these 3 professions of loyalty and devotion. I think it's also easy to see why Peter is hurt when Jesus asks him a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" You know everything, Lord. You know that I love you. But what might not be quite so easy to see is the way that Jesus draws Peter into a new relationship. Keep in mind that when Peter was in the courtyard of the high priest, he didn't deny the divinity of Jesus or Jesus' claim to be the Messiah. What Peter denied was his relationship with Jesus. When he is asked twice, "You are one of his disciples, aren't you?" Peter says, "I am not." And when he's challenged a 3rd time, he denies knowing the man. "I do not know the man." Now, as Jesus and Peter walk beside the lake, Jesus not only restores that relationship with Peter, but creates a whole new one. And by the 3rd time he questions Simon, son of John, he is asking for more than a general compassion or affection. Jesus is asking Peter, "Do you love me like a brother? You claim me to be your friend. Can I claim you as my friend?" Peter's distress is almost as important as his words. "You know everything, Lord. You know I love you. You know all of my failings and my weaknesses. You know all of my sin. But if you still want me as your friend, I want to be that friend with you, to you." "Feed my sheep," Jesus tells him. Up to this point, Jesus has portrayed himself as the good shepherd. Now he's entrusting the care of his flock to Peter. And it isn't that sheep have replaced fish in importance, but shepherding has been added to fishing. And Jesus ends the conversation the same way he began his relationship with Simon and the other fishermen back at the start of his ministry. He says, "Come, follow me." Follow me, Jesus calls to us now. Follow me, whether we are fishing or herding his sheep. Follow me when he calls us to change the way we've always done things so that he can bless us with abundance. Follow me as he prepares a feast for us that combines what he provides with what we offer ourselves. Follow me into this close friendship, this close relationship, this deep love relationship where all things can be forgiven and all can be made whole. Jesus calls. Will we follow? In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.